The shadow of secrets. In the dim corridors of history, there are stories whispered rather than told. Shadows that stretch far beyond their origins. One such story begins in the clandestine heart of the CIA during the height of the Cold War. It was a time when paranoia ruled, when the United States feared not only bombs and spies, but also something far more insidious: the idea that the human mind itself could be weaponized. In 1973, in an extraordinary act of secrecy, the director of the CIA ordered that thousands of files related to one of the agency's most disturbing projects be destroyed. But secrets have a way of surviving. A handful of documents escaped the flames, and they revealed fragments of something chilling: a program codenamed MKUltra. Even the few surviving pages hinted at a vast, terrifying experiment that sought nothing less than control over human thought. The name MKUltra has since become synonymous with horror cloaked in bureaucracy, a reminder of how far governments will go when driven by fear and ambition. It began as an attempt to fight the invisible weapons of America's enemies, but it soon turned inward, targeting not enemy soldiers, but unsuspecting civilians, students, prisoners, and patients. Behind the locked doors of laboratories and psychiatric wards, scientists funded by the CIA carried out experiments that blurred the line between research and torture. Imagine a world where you could no longer trust your own mind, where your thoughts, your will, your very sense of self could be rewritten. That was the nightmare MKUltra sought to make real. Under the cover of science, the CIA explored the use of hallucinogenic drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation. They wanted to know, could they break a mind? Could they build a new one from the pieces? Witnesses and survivors describe experiments conducted without consent, where LSD was slipped into drinks, where volunteers thought they were joining harmless studies, only to awaken in a world of hallucinations and terror. Some never recovered, some did not survive. And the worst of it, most never even knew they had been used as pawns in a secret war. The Cold War was a time of endless shadows, but MKUltra was one of its darkest. The program was not science fiction. It was not rumor. It was real, funded with taxpayer dollars, hidden behind official denials, and revealed only by accident when scraps of its paper trail surfaced. To this day, the full extent of what MKUltra achieved or attempted remains unknown. The deliberate destruction of evidence left behind a puzzle with missing pieces. A mystery that continues to unsettle decades later. This is where our story begins, in the silence left by shredded documents, in the haunted recollections of those who endured experiments they never consented to, and in the gnawing fear that the truth is still out there. MKUltra was more than a project. It was a Pandora's box that once opened, proved impossible to close. And so the question lingers. If the government could once sanction such violations of human dignity in the name of security, what might it be willing to do again? The shadow of MKUltra stretches far beyond its own time, casting doubt on the very idea of freedom in a world where the mind itself could be made a battlefield. Origins in the Cold War. To understand the birth of MKUltra, one must first step back into the tense and paranoid atmosphere of the early Cold War. The world had barely emerged from the devastation of World War II when new conflicts began to form, not on the battlefield, but in the realm of ideology and intelligence. The United States and the Soviet Union, once reluctant allies, now stood on opposite sides of an invisible curtain that divided the globe into East and West. In Washington, fears of Soviet advances in science and technology fueled a climate of constant suspicion. Reports filtered in that the Soviets were experimenting with psychological conditioning, hypnosis, and chemical manipulation of the human mind. Some intelligence officers whispered about a terrifying possibility: that Moscow might develop methods to control thought, turning loyal citizens into traitors, or worse, into programmable assassins. These anxieties were compounded by real-world examples. In the aftermath of the Korean War, American POWs returned home displaying signs of what some described as brainwashing. Captured soldiers had confessed to crimes they had not committed, denounced their own country, and praised their captors. The idea that the human mind could be broken, reshaped, and controlled by enemy hands sent shockwaves through military and intelligence communities. The CIA, still a relatively young organization at the time, took these reports with deadly seriousness. To fall behind in the arena of psychological warfare was to risk national security itself. If the Soviets or the Chinese could master the art of manipulating human thought, then America had to do the same, and do it better. The roots of MKUltra can be traced to earlier projects with chilling names: Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke. These were the CIA's first forays into the science of the mind, early attempts to test hypnosis, truth serums, and chemical agents as tools of interrogation and control. But what began as small-scale research quickly expanded. By 1953, under the leadership of CIA Director Allen Dulles, the agency authorized something far more ambitious: a sprawling, multifaceted program that would become known as MKUltra. But justification was simple, at least to those in power. America could not afford to fall behind. In the words of officials, the mind was now a battlefield, and victory would belong to those who mastered it first. This mindset, born from fear and rivalry, opened the door to horrors disguised as research experiments that would leave scars on countless lives. It was within this crucible of Cold War paranoia that MKUltra took shape, fueled by secrecy, ambition, and the terrifying belief that in order to defend freedom, it was necessary to strip others of theirs. The birth of Project MKUltra. By 1953, the foundation was set for something unprecedented. Out of the ashes of World War II and the rising paranoia of the Cold War, the CIA formally authorized Project MKUltra under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who would come to be known as the agency's poisoner-in-chief. MKUltra became a sprawling operation with more than 150 known subprojects, ranging from the bizarre to the horrifying. The project officially began on April 13, 1953, when CIA Director Allen Dulles gave the green light. In his speech at Princeton University, Dulles warned that the human mind was now a battlefield, and that America could not afford to fall behind. Behind closed doors, the CIA's technical services staff took up the task of pushing science and ethics beyond recognizable limits. The scope of MKUltra was staggering. The program's architects sought not just to study the effects of drugs and hypnosis, but to weaponize them. They dreamed of creating the perfect spy, the unbreakable soldier, the unwilling assassin. Could a man's personality be stripped away and replaced with another? Could a prisoner be broken until he betrayed every secret? Could a civilian, unaware of their role, be programmed to carry out acts against their will? Sidney Gottlieb's team believed they could find the answers. Using front organizations, the CIA funneled money into universities, hospitals, and research centers. Often, even the scientists conducting the work did not know their funding came from Langley. The agency cloaked its operations under innocent-sounding contracts, allowing MKUltra to spread its reach into countless institutions across the country. Central to the program was experimentation with LSD, a powerful hallucinogen that had only recently been discovered. To Gottlieb and his colleagues, LSD was the key that might unlock the mind's deepest secrets or break it entirely. They administered it to willing volunteers, to unsuspecting civilians, to prisoners and patients who had no idea they were subjects in a government experiment. The results were unpredictable. Some participants experienced euphoria, others terror, and still others lasting psychological damage. But LSD was only the beginning. MKUltra tested barbiturates, amphetamines, and exotic chemicals with names that read like entries from a nightmare. They combined drugs with techniques like sensory deprivation, electroshock, and hypnosis. The program was not a single experiment, but a vast labyrinth of trials designed to probe the fragile boundaries of human consciousness. The CIA justified all of this with a chilling rationale. America's enemies were already doing it. In their eyes, MKUltra was a defensive necessity, a brutal race to ensure the survival of the nation. But in truth, the program crossed moral lines so severe that even today, decades after its exposure, the full extent of its abuses remains shrouded in secrecy. Thus, in 1953, Project MKUltra was born, not as a scientific endeavor, but as a weapon, forged in fear and wielded against the very people it claimed to protect. The science of control. MKUltra's foundation rested on a chilling ambition to discover if the human mind could be broken and reshaped like clay. The CIA believed that if they could master the science of control, they would possess the ultimate weapon in psychological warfare. This belief fueled a series of experiments that blurred the line between medical research and cruelty, between science and horror. At the center of this pursuit was LSD, a chemical so powerful and unpredictable that it quickly became the drug of choice for MKUltra researchers. Sidney Gottlieb and his team saw LSD not only as a hallucinogen, but as a potential truth serum, a chemical key capable of unlocking suppressed memories, or perhaps inducing states of complete suggestibility. Experiments involved giving the drug to CIA employees, soldiers, prisoners, hospital patients, and even unsuspecting civilians in public places. Reports described victims experiencing terror, paranoia, and in some cases, permanent psychological damage. But LSD was just one tool in a vast arsenal. MKUltra researchers also experimented with barbiturates and amphetamines, sometimes administering them in rapid succession. The goal was to induce states of confusion, break down defenses, and leave subjects vulnerable to suggestion. Electroconvulsive therapy was pushed beyond therapeutic levels, used not to heal, but to shatter memory and willpower. In some cases, entire identities were erased, leaving behind broken shells of the people who had entered the experiments. Hypnosis was another avenue explored. Could a subject be hypnotized to carry out orders against their own moral code? Could a memory be implanted, or a real one erased entirely? CIA records revealed chilling attempts to answer these questions, with subjects placed in altered states and fed suggestions that blurred the boundary between reality and illusion. Sensory deprivation chambers further pushed human resilience to its limits. In these experiments, subjects were isolated in soundproof, lightless rooms for days on end. Deprived of external stimuli, the mind began to fracture, conjuring hallucinations and paranoia. To the researchers, this state of disorientation presented an opportunity. Perhaps a mind stripped of its normal defenses could be rebuilt with new programming. The science of control also extended into more invasive procedures. Experiments included chemical lobotomies, the administration of paralytics, and attempts to manipulate brain function through direct electrical stimulation. Each test carried the same underlying question: how far could they go in reshaping the mind before it broke beyond repair? For those inside MKUltra, these experiments were justified as national security necessities. But for the victims, many of whom never consented, never even knew they had been enrolled, it was a descent into nightmare. Some walked away scarred but alive. Others never walked away at all. By the late 1950s, MKUltra had become a labyrinth of inhuman experiments, all conducted under the guise of science. It was no longer about whether the mind could be controlled. It was about how much human suffering the CIA was willing to inflict to find out. Universities and hidden labs. One of the most unsettling aspects of MKUltra was how deeply it infiltrated respected institutions of science and learning. Universities, hospitals, and research centers across the United States and even abroad became silent partners in a project that violated the very principles of ethics and human rights. To many of the researchers involved, the grants and funding seemed like opportunities to explore cutting-edge science. Few asked where the money came from or what it was truly funding. Through a network of front organizations, the CIA funneled money into prestigious universities such as Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia. On the surface, the research appeared legitimate. Studies into cognition, behavior, and the effects of drugs on the human brain. Behind the scenes, however, much of this work fed directly into MKUltra's hidden objectives testing methods of control, manipulation, and psychological domination. Some professors and scientists were fully aware of their role in the program. Others conducted experiments under the illusion of academic freedom, unaware that their work was being directed and weaponized by the CIA. In some cases, students became unwitting test subjects, taking part in experiments involving hallucinogens, hypnosis, or sleep deprivation, without knowing the true scope of what they had volunteered for. The program's reach extended far beyond academia. Hospitals and psychiatric clinics also became sites of experimentation. Patients who had checked in for treatment of minor ailments or psychological distress were sometimes subjected to extreme and dangerous procedures. In Canada, Dr. Ewan Cameron, a respected psychiatrist at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, carried out experiments that became infamous for their cruelty. Cameron subjected patients to drug-induced comas, repeated electroshock treatments, and endless recorded messages designed to erase and rewrite their personalities. Many of his victims never recovered. Even prisons were not spared. Inmates were offered reduced sentences or privileges in exchange for participating in experiments. Many had no idea what they were signing up for. Instead of rehabilitation, they found themselves used as guinea pigs for hallucinogenic drugs, mind-altering chemicals, and psychological torment. Some left prison broken. Their sentences effectively extended into lifetimes of trauma. The most disturbing element in all of this was the invisibility of the victims. Unlike soldiers who had at least consented to serve their country, the students, patients, and prisoners who became subjects of MKUltra had never agreed to become pawns in an experiment. They were betrayed by the very institutions meant to protect and guide them, by universities tasked with nurturing minds, by hospitals entrusted with healing, and by governments sworn to defend freedom. MKUltra thrived in these hidden spaces, shielded by the respectability of the institutions it infiltrated. This blending of legitimate science with clandestine experimentation ensured that the program's crimes remained concealed for decades. And in doing so, it left behind a legacy of mistrust, a reminder that even the most respected halls of learning can become sites of horror when secrecy and power collide. The unwitting victims. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of MKUltra lies in its victims, ordinary people, who never chose to become part of the CIA's dark experiment. These were not enemy combatants or spies, but students, patients, prisoners, and citizens who trusted the institutions around them. Their lives were upended, their minds tampered with, and their identities forever scarred. One of the most common tactics employed by MKUltra was the administration of LSD without the subject's knowledge. Agents slipped doses into drinks at bars, cafes, and even at CIA social gatherings. The goal was to observe how unsuspecting individuals reacted, testing whether hallucinogens could destabilize or manipulate behavior. Some participants experienced terror, paranoia, and hallucinations so intense that they never fully recovered. For others, the experience left long-lasting mental health issues that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Hospitals and psychiatric wards were also fertile ground for experimentation. Patients who sought help for minor conditions sometimes found themselves subjected to powerful drugs, extended comas, and brutal electroshock treatments. In Canada, Dr. Ewan Cameron's work under the MKUltra umbrella left many patients permanently damaged, their personalities erased, and replaced with fragmented shadows of who they once were. They had sought healing, but were instead broken in the name of science. Prisoners, too, were manipulated into becoming test subjects. Some were offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation, but they were never told the true risks. Behind bars, they were given hallucinogens and subjected to experiments designed to test control over aggression, obedience, and psychological resilience. For many, their prison sentences became life sentences of trauma, as the experiments inflicted lasting harm on their mental health. The cruelty of MKUltra lay not only in the experiments themselves, but in the betrayal of trust. Citizens believed that universities, hospitals, and government institutions existed to protect them. Instead, those very institutions became instruments of violation. The program turned places of safety into sites of horror, making victims out of the innocent and powerless. Some survivors eventually came forward, telling stories of confusion, terror, and betrayal. Others were silenced by stigma or fear, and countless more never even realized they had been part of a grand experiment, their altered memories leaving them with only fragments of inexplicable suffering. The secrecy ensured that for many, closure was impossible. In the end, the unwitting victims of MKUltra were not just test subjects, they were casualties of a hidden war. People who paid the price for the CIA's obsession with control. Their suffering remains a dark testament to the dangers of unchecked power and to the ease with which human dignity can be sacrificed in the name of national security. Operation Midnight Climax. Among the many disturbing subprojects of MKUltra, few were as surreal and unsettling as Operation Midnight Climax. Conceived in the mid-1950s, this operation turned entire neighborhoods into laboratories of manipulation and surveillance. It combined espionage, vice, and psychological experimentation into a bizarre theater of control that blurred the line between science and exploitation. The operation was established in safe houses located in San Francisco and New York. These safe houses were outfitted with hidden microphones, one-way mirrors, and recording devices. Behind these mirrors sat CIA operatives, observing every detail of what unfolded inside. The plan was simple yet sinister. Lure unsuspecting men into the safe houses with the help of prostitutes hired by the CIA. Dose them with LSD and watch what happened. Dive. The prostitutes, acting as covert agents, were instructed to bring men back to the safe houses under the guise of typical encounters. Once there, drinks laced with hallucinogens were offered, and the subjects became unwitting participants in MKUltra's grand experiment. The CIA wanted to study the effects of LSD on behavior, particularly in scenarios involving trust, vulnerability, and intimacy. They also hoped to explore whether drugs could be used to manipulate individuals into divulging secrets or complying with instructions. What unfolded in these safe houses was both grotesque and tragic. Some victims became paranoid, terrified, or violent under the influence of the drugs. Others experienced hallucinations that left them psychologically shaken long after the encounter ended. To the CIA, these reactions were data points, evidence that the mind could be destabilized and bent to external influence. For the operatives running the program, however, there was another, more troubling aspect: the voyeuristic thrill. Reports suggest that some agents took pleasure in watching the encounters, blurring the line between scientific observation and sadistic entertainment. This degradation of both science and morality highlighted the depravity that MKUltra had unleashed. Operation Midnight Climax also served as a testing ground for surveillance techniques. The CIA experimented with hidden microphones, recording devices, and even early forms of wiretapping. The safe houses became a fusion of laboratory and stage, where lives were manipulated in the name of national security. The operation ran for nearly a decade before being quietly shut down. Few of its victims ever knew they had been used in such an experiment. To this day, the details remain murky, with much of the evidence destroyed along with other MKUltra records. But the legacy of Operation Midnight Climax endures as one of the most disturbing examples of how far the CIA was willing to go in its quest for control. In the shadowy world of MKUltra, Operation Midnight Climax stands out not just for its cruelty, but for its surreal absurdity, a reminder that when secrecy and power collide, even the most unthinkable experiments can become reality. The tragic death of Frank Olson. In the dark history of MKUltra, no single story captures its cruelty and secrecy more than the tragic death of Dr. Frank Olson. Olson was a bacteriologist and biological warfare scientist who worked at Fort Detrick, Maryland for the U.S. Army. By the early 1950s, he was also drawn into the CIA's experiments on mind control, chemical warfare, and the use of hallucinogens. His knowledge made him both valuable and ultimately vulnerable. In November 1953, Olson attended a CIA retreat at a cabin in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. Unbeknownst to him, he and several others were dosed with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb as part of a covert MKUltra experiment. Olson's reaction was far from controlled curiosity. It was panic, confusion, and despair. Friends noted that in the days following the incident, Olson became withdrawn, agitated, and increasingly paranoid. He confided to colleagues and family that he felt he had made a terrible mistake and that he no longer wished to continue his work. Less than 2 weeks later, on November 28, 1953, Frank Olson fell to his death from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. The CIA claimed it was suicide, the result of a psychological breakdown. But the circumstances raised immediate suspicion. Olsen had reportedly expressed doubts about the morality of his work, and may have threatened to resign, potentially exposing sensitive secrets. His sudden death conveniently ensured his silence. For decades, the Olsen family was told little beyond the official story. It wasn't until the 1970s, during the Church Committee hearings into CIA abuses, that the truth began to emerge. Declassified documents revealed Olsen had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge, and that his mental state deteriorated rapidly afterward. In 1975, President Gerald Ford personally met with Olsen's family to apologize, a rare act of acknowledgement from the highest office. Yet the mystery did not end there. In the 1990s, Olsen's body was exhumed. Forensic experts found evidence of head trauma inconsistent with a fall, suggesting he may have been struck before going out the window. This fueled theories that Olsen had been murdered, silenced because he knew too much about MKUltra, biological weapons, and the CIA's darkest secrets. To this day, his death remains one of the most chilling and unresolved episodes in the history of U.S. intelligence. The case of Frank Olson stands as a haunting reminder of how far the CIA was willing to go to protect its secrets. Whether driven to suicide or murdered outright, Olsen became both a victim of MKUltra and a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power. His story forces us to ask, how many others were silenced, their truths buried along with them? Psychological torture. If there is one thread that runs through the story of MKUltra, it is the deliberate use of psychological torture as a tool of experimentation. The CIA was not simply interested in understanding the mind, it sought to dominate it, to bend and break it until nothing of the original personality remained. In this pursuit, methods of cruelty once reserved for the darkest of regimes became instruments of American intelligence. Subjects were placed in isolation for days or weeks at a time, locked in soundproof rooms where light was extinguished and time lost all meaning. Deprived of sensory input, the human brain began to unravel, producing hallucinations, paranoia, and eventual submission. The CIA's operatives believed that once a subject's mental defenses were shattered, the mind could be reprogrammed like a blank slate. Electroshock therapy, normally used in psychiatry under carefully controlled conditions, was weaponized. Patients were subjected to shocks of far greater intensity and frequency than therapeutic practice allowed. Rather than healing, the shocks induced amnesia, confusion, and fear. Victims often forgot not only the experiments themselves, but even their own identities. For the CIA, this erasure was not a tragedy, but a triumph, proof that memories could be destroyed at will. Sleep deprivation became another favored technique. Subjects were kept awake for days, their minds breaking under the weight of exhaustion. Combined with hallucinogenic drugs, the effect was devastating. Sleep-starved and chemically destabilized, victims lost the ability to distinguish between reality and illusion. In such states, researchers tested whether subjects could be coerced into confessions, obedience, or programmed behavior. Hypnosis was layered into these torments. Once a subject was sufficiently broken, hypnotic suggestion was introduced to test if new behaviors or beliefs could be implanted. Some experiments attempted to create false memories, while others tested the possibility of triggering violent or self-destructive acts under command. While results were inconsistent, the very attempt revealed the depths of the agency's ambitions. The cruelty extended further with combinations of drugs, shocks, and isolation. Some subjects were placed in drug-induced comas, only to be awoken periodically with recordings played on repeat endless mantras intended to overwrite their thoughts. Others endured weeks of alternating hallucination and silence, their will eroded until they were shells of their former selves. What makes these acts especially disturbing is that many of the victims had never consented to participate. Some were psychiatric patients seeking treatment, others prisoners without choice, and still others civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. For them, the experiments were not research, but torment, psychological torture inflicted under the seal of secrecy. There, the legacy of MKUltra's psychological torture is a reminder that science without ethics becomes indistinguishable from brutality. What the CIA called experimentation was in truth an assault on the human spirit. It asked a terrifying question: how much suffering could the mind endure before it surrendered completely? And in asking it, MKUltra crossed a line that can never be erased. MKUltra and the prison experiments. Prisons across the United States became some of the darkest laboratories of MKUltra. Behind the bars of correctional facilities, the CIA found a steady supply of subjects who had little power to refuse and whose voices would never be heard beyond prison walls. For the agency, inmates were expendable. For the prisoners, participation often seemed like the only way to secure privileges or lighter sentences. Few understood the true horror of what awaited them. In facilities such as the Lexington Narcotics Farm in Kentucky, prisoners battling addiction were promised treatment and rehabilitation. Instead, many were subjected to endless experimentation. High doses of LSD, barbiturates, and amphetamines were administered under the guise of therapy. Addicts desperate for relief were offered drugs as rewards for participation, binding them to cycles of dependence and manipulation. The CIA carefully observed the effects, testing whether drugs could break down resistance, foster obedience, or induce complete submission. Elsewhere, prison populations were exposed to experiments in sensory deprivation, prolonged isolation, and psychological pressure. Guards and researchers pushed prisoners to their mental limits, observing how quickly the human mind unraveled when stripped of freedom and control. Some inmates were unknowingly given hallucinogens that triggered terrifying experiences, leaving them shaken long after the experiments ended. Others were subjected to combinations of drugs and hypnosis, their identities probed and reshaped in ways they could not comprehend. Perhaps the most infamous prison experiments were those conducted by Dr. Harris Isbell, who oversaw research at the Lexington facility. Isbell administered LSD to prisoners hundreds of times, in some cases over the course of weeks, pushing the boundaries of human tolerance. These experiments were less about treatment and more about control, whether chemical, psychological, or behavioral. The prisoners, many of them poor or marginalized, had little choice but to comply. The CIA justified these practices by framing them as necessary for national security. But for the inmates, the reality was exploitation, betrayal, and suffering. Their prison sentences became double punishments: incarceration by the state and experimentation by an intelligence agency that saw them as disposable. The legacy of MKUltra's prison experiments highlights one of the program's most chilling truths: that vulnerability and powerlessness were deliberately exploited in the name of science and control. Inmates already denied their freedom found even their minds were not their own. For them, prison walls were not only barriers of stone and steel, but cages of the mind, constructed by forces they never even knew were watching. The web of subprojects. MKUltra was never a single experiment or even a small cluster of research. It was a vast web sprawling across universities, hospitals, prisons, and military bases, entangling hundreds of researchers and thousands of unwitting participants. At its height, the program included over 150 documented subprojects, each exploring a different facet of mind control, behavior modification, or psychological warfare. Some subprojects focused exclusively on chemical experimentation. LSD remained the centerpiece, but researchers also tested mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, amphetamines, and even exotic toxins derived from plants and animals. Each drug was measured not only for its immediate psychological effects, but for its potential to erode resistance, induce compliance, or obliterate memory. To the CIA, the human mind was a laboratory in which every chemical reaction held the possibility of control. Other subprojects ventured into hypnosis, probing whether suggestions planted under trance could compel individuals to act against their will. Could someone be hypnotized into revealing secrets, committing crimes, or even taking another life? Though results were mixed, the very act of pursuing such questions revealed the agency's willingness to explore the darkest possibilities. Still, other subprojects tested sensory deprivation and overstimulation. In soundproof chambers, subjects endured hours or days of silence until hallucinations and paranoia set in. Elsewhere, flashing lights and blaring sounds were used to overwhelm the senses, breaking down defenses until subjects were left disoriented and vulnerable. These methods sought to unbalance the mind, opening the door for reprogramming. Some subprojects even crossed into biological and technological territory. The CIA investigated whether brain implants could control behavior, or whether chemicals could be dispersed through air, water, or food supplies to affect populations. In the shadows of these experiments lurked the specter of mass control, a chilling reminder of how far ambition could extend when unchecked. The sheer diversity of MKUltra's subprojects made it nearly impossible to track, even for those within the agency. Funds were laundered through front organizations, grants disguised as academic research, and partnerships hidden under layers of secrecy. In many cases, researchers did not know they were contributing to MKUltra. Others suspected, but chose silence in exchange for funding and prestige. The destruction of MKUltra's records in 1973 ensured that much of this web remains unknown. What we know comes from fragments, documents that survived by accident, testimonies from whistleblowers, and scattered reports uncovered by congressional inquiries. These fragments are enough to paint a picture of breathtaking scope, a program that sought to explore every imaginable avenue of control, from the individual mind to entire societies. MKUltra's web of subprojects reminds us of a disturbing truth. Secrecy allows power to metastasize, growing into forms too vast to comprehend until it is too late. In its ambition to master the mind, the CIA created a labyrinth of science and cruelty, whose full extent we may never know. Whispers of assassins. Among the darkest legends born from MKUltra was the idea that the CIA attempted to create programmed assassins. These whispers fueled countless conspiracy theories and inspired works of fiction like The Manchurian Candidate. But behind the fiction were chilling fragments of truth, drawn from testimony, declassified files, and the hints left by projects hidden within MKUltra's labyrinth. Some subprojects focus specifically on hypnosis combined with drugs, testing whether individuals could be conditioned to carry out acts they would normally resist. Could a soldier, under deep trance and chemical influence, be compelled to fire on his comrades? Could a civilian be unknowingly primed to carry out an assassination, triggered later by a simple cue, a word, a gesture, a sound? These questions were not science fiction to the CIA. They were objectives worth pursuing. Testimonies from former researchers and participants suggest chilling possibilities. Subjects reported undergoing sessions where their memories were deliberately erased, replaced by false recollections designed to obscure what had been done. Others described being trained under hypnotic suggestion to perform tasks on command, with no conscious memory of the events once they awoke. Though definitive proof remains elusive, the patterns described align too closely with MKUltra's broader goals to dismiss entirely. The CIA also investigated the use of amnesia-inducing drugs in combination with conditioning. The idea was to train an individual to perform a violent act and then wipe their memory, leaving no trace of their involvement. In theory, such a person could serve as the perfect covert agent, a tool who would not betray secrets because they themselves no longer knew them. These ideas reached the public consciousness in part because of leaks, rumors, and the testimony of people like Dr. George Estabrooks, a psychologist who claimed that creating hypnotically controlled operatives was entirely possible. Estabrooks even suggested that such methods had been successfully tested, though his claims remain unverified. Whether or not MKUltra succeeded in creating assassins is a question that may never be answered. The destruction of documents in 1973 ensured that the most damning evidence, if it ever existed, was lost. But the persistence of the rumor speaks volumes. It reflects both the scope of the program's ambition and the deep unease it generated. After all, if an intelligence agency was willing to dose unwitting citizens with LSD and erase memories with electroshock, why wouldn't they attempt something as radical as programming assassins? In the end, the whispers of assassins linger as part of MKUltra's legacy, a dark possibility that the human mind could be turned into a weapon, and that somewhere, hidden in the shadows of history, such weapons may have already been unleashed. The Church Committee Exposé. By the mid-1970s, the hidden machinery of MKUltra began to crack under the weight of exposure. The American public, shaken by the Watergate scandal and a series of intelligence leaks, demanded accountability. In response, the United States Senate formed the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church, to investigate abuses committed by intelligence agencies. Among the darkest revelations uncovered was the specter of MKUltra. The hearings revealed a program so vast and insidious that it stunned the nation. Senators listened in shock as witnesses described unwitting citizens being drugged, prisoners subjected to psychological torture, and patients experimented upon without consent. The secrecy had been nearly total, the destruction of documents nearly complete. Yet fragments remained, enough to paint a portrait of a program that had operated beyond morality and oversight. One of the most damning testimonies came from Dr. Sidney Gottlieb himself, the architect of MKUltra. Though evasive, his admissions confirmed what many had suspected, that the CIA had systematically tested hallucinogens, hypnosis, electroshock, and countless other methods on vulnerable populations. When pressed about the human cost, Gottlieb offered little remorse, framing the experiments as unfortunate necessities of the Cold War. The Church Committee also uncovered details about the death of Dr. Frank Olson, whose mysterious fall from a New York hotel window decades earlier was linked directly to MKUltra. His family's testimony underscored the human tragedy of the program and brought the hearings a chilling human face. It became clear that MKUltra was not only about science, but about lives destroyed in secrecy. For many Americans, the revelations shattered trust in government institutions. If the CIA was willing to use its own citizens as test subjects, what else was it capable of? The committee's findings forced the passage of reforms aimed at curbing intelligence abuses, including the creation of permanent oversight structures in Congress. Yet even these reforms could not undo the damage already done. What the Church Committee exposed was only the tip of the iceberg. The destruction of MKUltra's files in 1973 meant that the vast majority of its operations would never be fully known. Still, the hearings marked a turning point. For the first time, the secret world of mind control experiments was dragged into the light, and the public could no longer claim ignorance of the atrocities committed in their name. The Church Committee expose remains one of the most significant confrontations between secrecy and democracy in American history. It demonstrated the danger of unchecked power and the necessity of transparency. But it also left behind a haunting question. If so much had been destroyed, what horrors were buried forever, erased before they could be seen? The destruction of the files. If there was one act that ensured MKUltra would remain shrouded in mystery, it was the destruction of its records. In 1973, as the program's secrecy began to unravel and the CIA braced for greater scrutiny, then-Director Richard Helms ordered the wholesale destruction of MKUltra files. Thousands upon thousands of documents, contracts, research notes, reports, and memos were fed into shredders and incinerators, erasing decades of evidence. This act was not merely a bureaucratic cleanup. It was a calculated effort to bury the truth. With the files destroyed, investigators, journalists, and historians were left with fragments, scattered financial records, overlooked memoranda, and testimony from those who remember. The result was a patchwork of revelations, always incomplete, always leaving gaps too wide to bridge. The timing of the destruction is telling, coming just as public trust in government was collapsing after Watergate. Helms' decision signaled a fear that MKUltra, if fully exposed, would devastate the CIA's reputation beyond repair. By eliminating the paper trail, the agency could claim ignorance or dismiss accusations as rumor and speculation. For those seeking justice, the destruction of the files was a devastating blow. Victims who had been unknowingly drugged, hypnotized, or subjected to psychological torment were left with little evidence to support their claims. Families like that of Frank Olson, who sought answers for decades, found only walls of silence where records should have been. The destruction effectively guaranteed impunity for those responsible. Yet the act of erasure itself became damning evidence. Why destroy records unless there was something to hide? The absence of documentation created a void that was quickly filled by speculation, conspiracy theories, and suspicion. In attempting to erase its crimes, the CIA only deepened the aura of secrecy and mistrust surrounding MKUltra. Ironically, not all files were destroyed. A clerical error preserved about 20,000 financial documents, which later became the foundation of what we know today. But these were scraps, contracts, and expense reports rather than detailed experimental notes. The heart of MKUltra, the records that could have revealed its full scope and human cost, was lost forever. The destruction of the MKUltra files ensured that history would never know the full truth. It was an act of concealment that succeeded in protecting the perpetrators, but also condemned the program to eternal infamy. In the end, the silence of the shredded documents speaks as loudly as any revelation. Some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. Legacy and lessons of MKUltra. The legacy of MKUltra lingers like a shadow over American history. a reminder of how fragile the boundary between security and tyranny can be. Though the program officially ended in the 1970s, its consequences ripple into the present, shaping how citizens perceive their government and its institutions. It is a legacy written not only in documents and hearings, but in the lives shattered and the trust destroyed. One of the most enduring lessons of MKUltra is the danger of unchecked secrecy. Shielded from oversight, the CIA pursued experiments that violated basic human rights and ethical boundaries. Vulnerable populations, prisoners, patients, soldiers, addicts, were exploited in the name of science and national security. The destruction of files ensured that accountability would remain incomplete, but the fragments that survived revealed enough to erode public trust. For many Americans, MKUltra became synonymous with abuse of power. The psychological scars of the program were borne by countless victims, many of whom never fully understood what had been done to them. Some lived with paranoia, broken identities, or trauma that haunted them until their deaths. Others were silenced by stigma, their testimonies dismissed as delusion. The invisibility of their suffering underscores how secrecy compounds harm, not only hiding truth, but denying recognition. In the realm of science, MKUltra left a bitter aftertaste. Research into hallucinogens, hypnosis, and psychological conditioning was tainted by association with the program. Legitimate inquiry into these fields stalled for decades as funding dried up and reputations were destroyed. Only in recent years have scientists revisited psychedelics, this time with stricter ethical guidelines and therapeutic aims. The shadow of MKUltra looms over every discussion, a warning of what happens when science is corrupted by ambition. Politically, the scandal reinforced the need for oversight of intelligence agencies. The Church Committee's findings led to reforms, but the question remains whether those reforms are enough. In an age of mass surveillance, digital warfare, and artificial intelligence, the echoes of MKUltra warn us of the perils of trusting unchecked power with the keys to the human mind. Culturally, MKUltra has embedded itself in the public imagination. From novels to films to conspiracy theories, it symbolizes both the fascination with mind control and the paranoia that government secrecy breeds. While some depictions exaggerate or fictionalize the truth, the foundation of real atrocities ensures that MKUltra will never be dismissed as mere fantasy. Its name remains a chilling shorthand for manipulation and betrayal. In the end, MKUltra's greatest lesson may be its stark reminder of human vulnerability. The mind, though resilient, can be broken, reshaped, and controlled under the right conditions. That knowledge in the wrong hands is as dangerous as any weapon. MKUltra proved that once, and the world cannot afford to forget it. The program's ghosts continue to whisper through history. They ask us to remember the cost of secrecy, to guard against the erosion of rights, and to question the stories told by those in power. MKUltra is not just a chapter of the past, it is a warning to the future.